Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh. How are you, everyone? This is a short video to show you some of the things that you should take care of before setting for the exam. First of all, some of you asked me about what we have had in the textbook and in the novel. And I would happily say that we began the course with a general discussion of the modern novel and the characteristics of the modern and contemporary novel, talking about the form, talking about the content, and that was an essential part of the course that we had together before the lockdown. And then we moved to colonialism and post-colonialism, and we defined both. And we discussed lots of thinkers and lots of writings that belong to these two issues. And then we moved on to Orientalism and to the image of Africa that has been all the time vitiated or spoiled or distorted by colonial writers, and the fact that later on, after independence from colonization, some African writers like Chinua Achebe chose Chinua Achebe and Ahdaf Suwaif and lots of Oriental and African and even Asian writers began to what we call write back to the center, to try to correct the image of Africa. Actually, and indeed, not just by opposing the image of Africa described by Western writers, but by outlining the major points of African civilization, African history, African values, talking about the pros and cons in an objective way, as Chinua Achebe does. I have received a number of questions, and I will try to incorporate into this lecture too. And then we moved to a very interesting example of Orientalist discourse or colonialist discourse, and that was a short story written by Paul Bowles called Distant Episode. And in that short story we have a horrible picture actually of Arabs and Africans and Muslims being described in the short story as lacking in all basics of human civilization, as savage, as brutal, as absent-minded, as greedy, as people who are greedy for money, for sensuousness, for the pleasures of the body, and as people who are far dissociated from and divorced from all that is called civilization and even humanity and even principles, and nothing connects these kinds of vitiated or distorted figures to what we call civilization or decency or even humanity. The writer has been quite objective and quite intelligent actually in making use of all the artifacts and the tools of criticism and the tools of fiction that he has, and has made these subservient to his own issue or his own cause. It is not just the story of a professor of linguistics who has been to Morocco in order to study dialects, but it's a story of the West when it looks at the East. It's no more different from Kipling's idea. It's no more different from Conrad's idea. It's no more different from Joyce Carey's or Forster's ideas, but it is an intensified and condensed picture of the East and Africa, and it is a passive negative image that depends on the sense of smell, the sense of touch, the various senses that man possesses The writer makes use of all these in an indirect and objective way in order to drive home the idea that these kinds of people have to remain subjugated and to remain colonized by civilized classes of people like the French or the Americans or the British. That was an important introduction to the course, from which we moved to another small section, which is the poem written by T.S. Eliot at the beginning of the 20th century, The Journey of the Magi, in which some uh, evangelists, some monks traveled from certain parts of the universe towards Bethlehem in Palestine in order to witness the birth of Christ and to see for themselves how their own ramshackle world could be salvaged or could be saved. They went out on a journey together in order to see for themselves how they could absolve the world of all the sins and all the trouble and all the problems that it suffered from. And they go back to their country of origin quite lost, quite unchanged, quite listless. And this is a word that appears on the second or third page of the novel. They lack all desire and they lack all enthusiasm because according to the writer and according to many modern writers, man has lost all sense of meaning and all sense of belonging and attachment, and the whole world, according to these writers, is lacking in meaning and value and even humanity. Perhaps that was an interesting introduction to our novel, No Longer at Ease. It describes a world that is no longer at ease, a line that is taken from this poem, and it applies it not to a modern man from America or from France or Germany, but to a contemporary young man from Nigeria, who is supposed to encapsulate all the interesting, the vigorous, the enthusiastic, encouraging values of young men and women who came out of colonization and who got their independence and who are now ready to rule their country and to lead the country and to be there in very important posts like the scholarship bureau. He went to England to study the law in order to help his people with their land issues, but he changed his mind and he studied English. Maybe this changed him and made of him a totally different person. But now I'm getting into the course and explaining the course rather than showing you the kinds of questions that you can expect. So this is roughly the course and the course contents. If you are talking about page numbers, for example, I could happily tell you that we are, as I said last time, we are into the middle of chapter 5. So you could consider chapter 5 to be our last point. Say chapter 5, yes, which is almost half of the book, almost half. And all of this has been explained in detail in lectures before the lockdown and in online lectures and in PowerPoint presentations. So as you can see, and as you know, my own methodology, I'm not someone who just asks very simple questions like the ones, for example, here. You have certain, let me start with the simple ones. I found this actually online, and they are quite nice and helpful, and some of them will be there in the exam, I promise. In which year was the novel written? It was written in 1960, and this is in red. The novel is set in the 50s. The action of the novel takes place in Nigeria. So you have multiple choice questions, very easy ones, and then moderate ones. I'm not going to say complex or very difficult ones. The novel is part of Achebe's which kind of trilogy? A trilogy means 3 novels, starting with Things Fall Apart, and then No Longer at Ease and Arrow of Gold. Obi is what of the main character